there is a script no one alive can read. It was carved into stone, pressed into clay, and painted onto pottery by a civilization of perhaps 5 million people, spread across a territory larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. They built cities with straight roads, indoor plumbing, and public baths more than 4,000 years ago. They traded with Sumer and sailed the Arabian Sea. They standardized their bricks, their weights, their measures, across a region spanning more than 1 million square kilometers. And then, without warning, they vanished. Their cities crumbled. Their language died. And the symbols they left behind, those small mysterious marks etched onto thousands of seals and tablets, remain locked in silence. After more than a century of effort by linguists, cryptographers, mathematicians, and artificial intelligence, not a single sentence of the Indus script has been reliably translated. We do not know what language these people spoke. We do not know what they believed. We do not know what they called themselves. We do not know what they named their cities, their rivers, or their gods. 5 million people, gone, and they left behind a puzzle that has defeated every mind that has tried to solve it. Think about that for a moment. We can read Egyptian hieroglyphs. We cracked that code in the 1820s, thanks to the Rosetta Stone and the genius of Jean-François Champollion. We can read Sumerian cuneiform, the oldest known writing system, thanks to the Behistun inscription and a century of painstaking scholarship. We can read Akkadian, Hittite, Ugaritic, and Linear B from Mycenaean Greece. These were all once lost scripts, mysterious marks that baffled scholars for decades or centuries, and in each case, dedicated researchers found the key. But the Indus script stands apart. There is no bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone equivalent, no long passage of text that might give us enough material to work with. The longest known Indus inscription contains only 26 symbols, most contain fewer than 5. Imagine trying to reconstruct an entire language, an entire civilization's inner life, from fragments that short. It would be like trying to understand modern English from nothing but license plates and bumper stickers. A few characters here, a few characters there, and no context, no grammar, no stories, no sentences. The Indus Valley Civilization, also called the Harappan Civilization, after one of its major cities, flourished across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India during the Bronze Age. According to archaeological estimates, it lasted from roughly 2600 to 1900 before the Common Era, though some scholars push the origins back significantly further. At its height, it covered an area of approximately 1.3 million square kilometers, making it, by some measures, the largest of all Bronze Age civilizations, larger than Egypt, larger than Mesopotamia. Its two greatest cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, each held populations estimated between 30,000 and 50,000 people. They had granaries, assembly halls, and drainage systems of such sophistication that nothing comparable would be built in Europe for thousands of years. They conducted trade that reached from the mountains of Afghanistan to the ports of the Persian Gulf. They created art, jewelry, and tools of extraordinary beauty and precision. And yet, when these cities were rediscovered in the 1820s and excavated seriously beginning in the 1920s, the world realized something deeply troubling. We had found a great civilization, one of the oldest and largest on the planet, and we could not understand a single word it had written. Not one word, not one name, not one prayer or law or love letter or receipt. The realization sank in slowly, over decades of excavation and study, and it has never stopped being disturbing. Every year more seals are unearthed, more inscriptions are catalogued, more scholars devote their careers to the puzzle, and every year the silence holds. The symbols stare back at us, row after row, seal after seal, as mute today as they were on the day the last Harappan, who could read them, closed their eyes for the final time 4,000 years ago. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand why the Indus script remains undeciphered, what it tells us about the limits of human knowledge, and why this silence from the ancient past should unsettle anyone who thinks we truly know our own history. You are going to learn about the cities that were buried for millennia, the symbols that have haunted scholars for generations, and the disturbing possibility that some knowledge, once lost, may be lost forever. This is not merely an academic puzzle. it is a warning. Civilizations can rise, flourish, achieve astonishing complexity, and then disappear so completely that even their words become unreadable. If it happened to them, a people who built one of the most advanced urban cultures the ancient world had ever seen, it forces a question none of us want to ask. What might future generations fail to read of ours? Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand the weight of what has been lost in the Indus Valley, we first need to understand the sheer scale of what was found. Because the Harappan civilization was not some minor settlement clinging to the banks of a river. It was an empire of cities, a vast network of trade, agriculture, craft production, and urban planning that stretched across an area larger than Western Europe. And for nearly 4,000 years, the modern world forgot it ever existed. The story of its rediscovery begins in 1826, when a British army deserter named Charles Masson wandered through the dusty plains of what is now Punjab, Pakistan. Masson, whose real name was James Lewis, had fled the East India Company's army and was living under an assumed identity, travelling through the region collecting coins and antiquities. Near the town of Harappa, he stumbled upon vast mounds of ancient ruins. He described a ruined brick castle with very high assaults and towers, surrounded by debris fields that stretched for hundreds of meters. Local villagers had been mining the ancient bricks for years, using them as building material for their homes, their walls, and their animal enclosures. When the British later began constructing the Lahore to Multan railway line, contractors took thousands upon thousands of Harappan bricks to use as ballast for the track bed. Thousands of years of history were being carted away in ox-drawn wagons, ground into gravel, and laid beneath train tracks. By the time professional archaeologists arrived to study the site, significant portions of Harappa had already been destroyed. The bricks that once formed granaries, workshops, and homes now lay crushed beneath iron rails, carrying goods and passengers who had no idea they were riding over the remains of one of the world's oldest cities. It took nearly a century from Masson's initial observation for the true significance of the site to be recognized. The first systematic excavations began in 1921 under the direction of Sir John Marshall, the Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India. Marshall was a classicist by training, more familiar with Greek and Roman ruins than with anything from the Indian subcontinent. But what his team uncovered at Harappa, and simultaneously a site called Mohenjo-Daro, roughly 600 kilometers to the south in the Sindh province, stunned him and stunned the archaeological world. These were not primitive villages, not rough clusters of mud huts gathered around a well. These were planned cities, laid out on a precise grid system, with wide main streets running north to south and east to west, and narrow side lanes branching off at right angles. The buildings were constructed from standardized kiln-fired bricks, all conforming to a ratio of 1:2:4 in thickness, width, and length. This level of standardization was unprecedented in the ancient world. It implied a central authority, a system of weights and measures, and a degree of social coordination that rivaled anything known from Egypt or Mesopotamia. Mohenjo-Daro, whose name translates roughly to Mound of the Dead in the Sindhi language, proved to be the more spectacular of the two initial sites. The city covered an area of roughly 250 hectares at its peak. Its buildings rose 2 and sometimes 3 stories high, constructed from those same standardized bricks. The city was divided into at least 2 major sections, a raised citadel area and a lower residential town. The citadel contained several large public buildings, the most famous of which is the Great Bath. This large rectangular pool measures approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 2.4 meters deep. It was lined with tightly fitted bricks, sealed with a layer of natural bitumen, a type of tar, to prevent leakage, and surrounded by a colonnade of brick pillars. Steps led down into the pool from either end. Scholars believe it served a ritual or ceremonial function, possibly related to purification rites. Though without inscriptions to confirm this, the interpretation remains speculative. The engineering required to make such a structure watertight more than 4,000 years ago without modern materials or techniques, speaks to a level of technical sophistication that still impresses modern engineers. The pool was designed not merely to hold water, but to be drained and refilled, with an outlet that fed into the city's larger drainage network. And that drainage network was itself a wonder. Nearly every house in Mohenjo-Daro had its own bathroom and toilet, connected by clay pipes to covered drains that ran beneath the streets. These drains were lined with brick, covered with stone slabs, and equipped with inspection holes so they could be cleaned and maintained. The household drains emptied into larger channels that ran along the main streets, and these channels eventually drained into cesspits, or settling tanks at the edge of the city. The system was not a one-time construction. Archaeological evidence shows that the drains were maintained, repaired, and upgraded over centuries, suggesting a continuous civic authority responsible for public sanitation. To put this in perspective, the City of London did not have a comparable sewer system until the 1860s, when the engineer Joseph Bazalgette designed the system that still forms the backbone of London's sewers. That is nearly 4,000 years after Mohenjo-Daro. The Romans, of course, built impressive aqueducts and the famous Cloaca Maxima, a great sewer that drained the Roman Forum. But the Roman system was built roughly 2,000 years after the Harappan one, and in many respects was less uniformly applied to the general population. While Roman plumbing often served elite households, public baths, and government buildings, the Harappan drainage system appears to have been available to the ordinary residents of the city. Even modest houses had drainage connections. The principle of public sanitation, of managing waste as a collective civic responsibility, was embedded in the fabric of Harappan urban life in a way that would not be seen again for millennia. The scale of the civilization that built these cities is difficult to grasp without comparison. Consider the territorial extent. Ancient Egypt, during the period of the Old Kingdom when the Great Pyramids were being constructed at Giza, controlled a territory along the Nile Valley measuring roughly 1,000 kilometers in length but relatively narrow, confined to the river's floodplain and delta. The Mesopotamian civilizations of Sumer and Akkad occupied the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, an area of perhaps 65,000 square kilometers at the height of their combined influence. The Harappan civilization, by contrast, covered an estimated 1.3 million square kilometers. That is roughly 20 times the area of Mesopotamia. It is larger than modern France, Germany, and Spain combined. More than 1,500 Harappan sites have been identified by archaeologists across this vast territory, from the coast of the Arabian Sea in the south to the foothills of the Himalayas in the north, and from the Makran coast near the border of Iran in the west to the outskirts of Delhi in the east. These sites range from tiny farming villages to major urban centers. The largest cities, Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, Ganweriwala, Rahigahi, and Dholavira, had populations in the tens of thousands. The smaller towns held populations of a few thousand each, and scattered between them were hundreds of villages, each linked to the others by trade routes, shared cultural practices, and that remarkable standardization of weights, measures, and building materials. A brick manufactured in Harappa was indistinguishable from a brick manufactured in Dholavira, more than 1,000 kilometers away. A weight used by a merchant in Lothal, a port city in Gujarat, was identical to a weight used by a merchant in Mohenjo-Daro. This uniformity across such a vast area is one of the most puzzling features of the Harappan civilization, because we do not know what political or administrative system enforced it. And here is where the first great mystery begins to take shape. Despite this enormous geographic reach, despite the hundreds of cities and towns, despite the evidence of long-distance trade and shared cultural practices, we have found no evidence of a king, no royal tombs filled with gold and precious objects, no palaces rising above the common buildings, no monumental statues of rulers gazing out over their domains, no inscriptions boasting of military conquests or divine favor. In Egypt, the pharaohs built pyramids that took decades and armies of laborers to construct, monuments to their own power and their desire for immortality. In Mesopotamia, kings like Sargon of Akkad and Hammurabi of Babylon left detailed records of their reigns, their laws, their wars, their building projects. Sargon boasted of conquering cities. Hammurabi inscribed his Lorktud on a stone astel for all to see. The Harappans left nothing of the kind. Their cities show a remarkable uniformity, an almost unsettling equality in their architecture. The houses vary in size, yes, and the larger ones presumably belonged to wealthier families. But there are no grand palaces towering above the rest, no throne rooms, no receiving halls decorated with scenes of royal power. The burials that have been found contain modest grave goods, pottery, personal ornaments, and occasionally tools, but nothing resembling the treasure-filled tombs of the Egyptian pharaohs or the royal tombs of Ur in Mesopotamia, where servants and attendants were buried alongside their rulers. The Harappan dead were buried simply, without display. Some archaeologists have suggested that the Harappan civilization may have been governed by a council of merchants or a collective authority rather than a single ruler. Others have proposed a priestly class, pointing to the Great Bath and other structures that may have served religious functions, and suggesting that the civilization was organized around ritual and shared belief rather than military power. Still others have argued that we are simply projecting our expectations onto the evidence, that our idea of what power looks like is shaped by Egypt and Mesopotamia, and that the Harappans may have organized their society in ways we do not yet understand and cannot recognize in the archaeological record. The truth is, we simply do not know, and the reason we do not know leads directly to the heart of the problem, the reason this documentary exists, the reason this question has haunted scholars for more than a century. We cannot read what they wrote. The Indus script was first noticed by Alexander Cunningham, the founder and first Director General of the Archaeological Survey of India, as early as 1875. That year, Cunningham published a report describing a seal found at Harappa, depicting an animal figure and bearing several mysterious symbols. He could not identify the script and compared it tentatively to scripts known from other Asian cultures, but his report drew little attention. The significance of the discovery was not understood. It was not until the large-scale excavations of the 1920s that the true extent of the writing system became apparent. As Marshall's teams dug deeper into the mounds of Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro, they unearthed thousands of inscribed objects, most of them small stone seals, typically square, measuring between 2 and 4 centimeters on each side. These seals were masterfully carved. On one face, they bore an image, usually an animal, rendered with striking naturalism and skill. The most common animal is a creature scholars have called the unicorn, a bull-like beast shown in profile with what appears to be a single horn. Whether this represents a real animal viewed from the side, with the far horn hidden behind the near one, or a mythical creature remains debated. Other seals depict elephants, rhinoceroses, water buffalo, tigers, and a distinctive humped bull that resembles the zebu cattle still found in South Asia today. Above these animal images, along the top of the seal, runs a line of symbols, the Indus script. The signs are small, compact, and often highly stylized. Some resemble human figures or body parts. Others look like plants, jars, or tools. Many are abstract geometric shapes with no obvious pictorial origin. The seals were almost certainly functional objects, used to stamp impressions into clay to mark property, seal trade goods, or identify individuals, much like a signature or a corporate logo. Impressions from Indus seals have been found on clay tags and sealings that were once attached to bundles of goods, confirming their use in trade. Similar practices existed in Mesopotamia, where cylinder seals were rolled across wet clay to leave an impression bearing the owner's name and title. But while we can read the cuneiform text on Mesopotamian seals, the Indus seals remain mute. Over 4,000 inscribed objects have been catalogued to date, bearing a total of approximately 400 to 450 distinct signs, depending on which scholar's classification system you follow. This number is crucial for understanding what kind of writing system we might be dealing with. An alphabet, like the English alphabet, uses a small set of signs, typically between 20 and 40, each representing a single consonant or vowel sound. A syllabary, like Japanese hiragana, uses a larger set of signs, typically between 50 and 100, each representing a syllable. A logosyllabic system, like Egyptian hieroglyphs or Chinese characters, uses hundreds or even thousands of signs, each representing a word, a morpheme, or a syllable. The Indus script, with its 400-odd signs, falls most naturally into the logosyllabic category. This suggests that each sign represents a word or a syllable, similar to the way Chinese characters work. But without a key, without a bilingual text, without even knowing what language underlies the script, the signs remain patterns, shapes, marks on stone, seen clearly but understood not at all. To understand how extraordinary this situation is, consider the history of decipherment and how other locked scripts were opened. Egyptian hieroglyphs were cracked in 1822 by Champollion, who used the Rosetta Stone, a slab inscribed with the same text in 3 scripts: hieroglyphs, Demotic Egyptian, and Ancient Greek. Because scholars could already read Greek, they used it as a lever to pry open the other 2 scripts. Linear B, the script used by the Mycenaean Greeks of the Late Bronze Age, was deciphered in 1952 by Michael Ventris, a young British architect with an extraordinary gift for pattern recognition. Ventris succeeded because he correctly guessed, after years of statistical analysis, that the underlying language was an early form of Greek. That guess gave him a foothold, and from that foothold, he was able to unlock the rest. Akkadian cuneiform was deciphered in the mid-1800s through the work of Henry Rawlinson, Edward Hincks, and others, aided by the Behistun inscription in Iran, a massive cliff face carving that contained the same text in Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian Akkadian. In every one of these successful decipherments, the scholar had at least one crucial advantage. Either there was a bilingual or multilingual text that provided a bridge between the unknown script and a known language, or there was a reasonable hypothesis about the underlying language that could be tested against the data, or both. With the Indus script, neither advantage exists. There is no bilingual inscription, no Rosetta Stone, and the underlying language is completely unknown. It could be an early form of Dravidian, the language family that includes modern Tamil, Telugu, Kannada, and Malayalam. It could be an early form of Indo-Aryan, related to Sanskrit and the Vedic language. It could belong to the Munda language family, related to languages still spoken by small populations in central and eastern India. It could be a language isolate, a tongue with no living relatives, like Sumerian in Mesopotamia or Basque in Europe. Each of these possibilities has been argued by serious scholars, and none has been definitively ruled out. We are, in effect, looking at a locked box and guessing what language might be inside, without even knowing what family of languages to start with. The comparison that best captures the difficulty is this. Imagine you are given a collection of 2,000 fortune cookie slips, written in an alphabet you have never seen, in a language you have never heard. Each slip contains between 2 and 15 characters. Most contain fewer than 5. You have no dictionary, no grammar book, no native speaker, and no other text in the same language. You do not even know whether the slips are written left to right to left, top to bottom, or in some other direction. You do not know whether the characters represent sounds, words, or something else entirely. Now imagine that these slips are your only evidence that an entire civilization ever existed, a civilization of millions of people who built great cities and traded across oceans. That is the Indus script problem, and after 100 years, no one has solved it. What scientists discovered when they examined the details of this civilization's collapse was worse than anyone expected. The core problem with the Indus Valley civilization is not simply that we cannot read their script. It is that everything we might use to solve the puzzle is either missing, damaged, or ambiguous. Every tool that has unlocked other ancient languages fails here. Every assumption that has guided successful decipherment elsewhere leads to a dead end in the Indus Valley. The Indus script is not just undeciphered. It is, by the standards of modern linguistics and cryptography, a problem that may be structurally unsolvable with the evidence currently available. And the more closely scholars examine the evidence, the more the problem deepens. To understand why, we need to examine the script itself in detail, sign by sign, pattern by pattern. The Indus script consists of between about 400 and 450 distinct signs, depending on which scholar's catalogue you consult. The most comprehensive and widely referenced catalogue was compiled by Iravatham Mahadevan, a retired Indian civil servant who devoted the last 4 decades of his life to studying the inscriptions. Mahadevan's Concordance, published in 1977, and revised in subsequent years, lists 3,573 lines of text from 2,159 inscribed objects. He identified 417 distinct signs, though the exact number is a matter of ongoing dispute, because the question of how many signs a script contains is not as simple as it might seem. The difficulty is this: when you look at two inscriptions and see a sign that looks like a fish on one seal and a slightly different fish on another, are you looking at the same sign written in two different styles or at two different signs? In modern English, this would be like asking whether a lowercase a and an uppercase A are the same letter or different letters. We know the answer because we know the language. But when the language is unknown, the question becomes agonizingly hard to resolve. Every decision about whether two variants are the same sign or different signs affects the total sign count, and the total sign count affects the statistical analysis, and the statistical analysis affects every hypothesis about the nature of the script. Small uncertainties at the foundational level cascade into large uncertainties at every level above. The signs themselves are small, compact, and often highly abstract. Some are clearly pictographic, depicting recognizable objects: a fish, a human figure, a jar, a plant, a wheel, a comb. Others are geometric, lines, curves, dots, and angles that have no obvious representational meaning. They were carved into steatite seals, incised into pottery, molded onto clay tablets, and occasionally scratched onto metal tools and ornaments. The direction of writing appears to have been primarily right to left, based on several types of evidence. On many seals, the signs on the left side of a line are more compressed than those on the right, suggesting that the carver began on the right and ran out of space toward the left. In some cases, lines that begin on the right side of the seal wrap around to continue on the left in the line below, a pattern consistent with right-to-left writing with line breaks. But even this basic feature is not certain. Some scholars have argued for boustrophedon writing, in which the direction alternates from line to line, and a few have even argued for left-to-right reading. Without being able to read the content, even the direction of the script remains a matter of educated guesswork. The brevity of the inscriptions is, without question, the single greatest obstacle to decipherment. It is the wall against which every attempt has shattered. The average inscription is about 5 signs long. 5 signs. In modern English, 5 characters barely make a word. The entire known corpus of Indus writing, if transcribed into a modern script, would fill perhaps 2 or 3 pages of text. That is it. 2 or 3 pages to represent the entire written output of a civilization that lasted 7 centuries and spanned more than 1,000,000 square kilometers. Of course, this almost certainly does not represent the full extent of Harappan writing. The seals and tablets that survive are made of durable materials, stone and fired clay, that resist decay. If the Harappans also wrote on organic materials like palm leaves, bark, cloth, or wood, as many South Asian cultures did in later periods, those writings would have decomposed long ago in the warm, humid climate of the Indus floodplain. But the fact remains that we have only what we have. And what we have is painfully insufficient for the task of decipherment. Compare the Indus corpus to the material that enabled other successful decipherments. The Rosetta Stone alone contains 14 lines of hieroglyphic text, 32 lines of Demotic script, and 54 lines of Greek, totaling well over 1,000 words. Champollion also had access to hundreds of other hieroglyphic inscriptions from temples, tombs, and monuments across Egypt, many of them containing the names of known pharaohs enclosed in oval cartouches. The Linear B tablets from the Mycenaean palaces of Pylos and Knossos number over 1,000, containing inventories of goods, lists of personnel, records of offerings to deities, and administrative accounts. Michael Ventris had thousands of signs to work with, enough to identify patterns, test hypotheses, and verify his readings. The Mesopotamian cuneiform corpus runs to hundreds of thousands of tablets, covering everything from accounting records to royal inscriptions to epic literature. Even Linear A, the Minoan script that remains undeciphered, has inscriptions averaging 7 to 8 signs, and the total corpus, while small, includes some individual texts of considerable length. The Indus script has none of these advantages. Its longest inscription, found at the site of Dholavira in Gujarat, India, consists of just 26 signs arranged in a row. This inscription is remarkable for its size, as the signs were inlaid into a wooden signboard and displayed prominently, apparently for public viewing. But 26 signs is still extraordinarily short, and the gap between this longest text and the average is enormous. The vast majority of inscriptions contain 3, 4, or 5 signs. Many contain just 1 or 2. Statistically, this means that the corpus provides very few instances of multi-sign sequences, the raw material that linguists need to identify grammatical patterns, recurring phrases, and syntactic structures. The question of what these short inscriptions represent, even in general terms, is fiercely debated. The most widely accepted hypothesis is that the seal inscriptions contain names or titles of individuals, families, clans, or institutions. This interpretation is based on analogy with Mesopotamian practices, where cylinder seals bore the owner's name and title, and were used to authorize documents and mark property. If the Indus seals functioned similarly, then the inscriptions might read something like property of merchant such and such, or seal of the house of so-and-so. This would explain both the breviary and the formulaic structure of the inscriptions, which often begin and end with a small recurring set of signs, as if following a template. But here's the problem. Names are among the hardest elements to decipher in any unknown script, because they do not follow predictable grammatical rules and often do not translate into meaningful words. If most Indus inscriptions are names, then they provide almost no grammatical information, and without grammar, decipherment is essentially impossible. There have been other theories. Some scholars have suggested that the inscriptions record the contents of trade goods, indicating what was in the bundle or container to which the seal was attached. Others have proposed that they record religious invocations, prayers, or blessings stamped onto objects for spiritual protection. Still, others have argued that the signs represent a kind of shorthand, abbreviating longer texts that were written out in full-on perishable materials. Each theory is plausible, none is provable, and all of them face the same fundamental limitation. Without a key, without a bilingual text, without a large corpus of connected text, every reading is a guess. The history of attempted decipherments is long, colourful, and largely dispiriting. More than 100 proposed readings have been published since the 1920s. In 1932, the Assyriologist G.R. Hunter produced the first systematic catalogue of the signs and attempted to identify structural patterns. Hunter recognized that certain signs appeared far more frequently than others, and that some signs tended to cluster together in recurring combinations. He noted that a small number of signs, perhaps 40 or 50, accounted for the majority of all occurrences, while hundreds of rarer signs appeared only a handful of times in the entire corpus. This frequency distribution is consistent with what linguists expect from a true writing system, where common function words appear far more often than rare content words, but it is also consistent with other structured symbolic systems, and Hunter could not advance beyond this observation without knowing what language was encoded. In the 1960s and 70s, two major teams took up the challenge independently, a Finnish team led by Asko Parpola at the University of Helsinki, and a Soviet team led by Yuri Knorozov in Leningrad. Both applied sophisticated analytical methods to the inscriptions. Knorozov was already famous for his groundbreaking work on the decipherment of Mayan glyphs, where he had correctly identified the script as a syllabic system encoding the Mayan language. His success with Mayan gave him both the credentials and the confidence to tackle the Indus problem. Using early mainframe computers, Knorozov's team performed statistical analyses of sign frequencies, positional patterns, and combinatorial rules. They concluded that the underlying language was likely Dravidian and proposed a number of specific readings. Parpola's team reached a similar conclusion through different methods, relying more heavily on iconographic analysis and the rebus principle, but neither team produced readings that could be independently verified. The fundamental problem remained. With such a small corpus and no knowledge of the underlying language, the statistical patterns were ambiguous, consistent with multiple interpretations, and there was no way to distinguish the correct one from the plausible but wrong ones. Knorozov's computational methods which had worked so brilliantly on the Mayan corpus, could not overcome the limitations of the Indus data. The Mayan corpus contained thousands of long inscriptions in a language still spoken by millions of people. The Indus corpus contained thousands of short inscriptions in a language spoken by no one. The difference was not one of degree but of kind. In the decades that followed, proposed decipherments continued to appear with regularity. An Indian scholar named S.R. Rao argued in the 1980s that the script was alphabetic, not logosyllabic, and that it encoded an early form of Sanskrit. His readings were detailed and systematic, but were widely rejected by other scholars, who pointed out that an alphabetic system of 400 signs makes no linguistic sense. Other proposed readings linked the script to Sumerian, to Munda languages, to Elamite, and to various hypothetical language families. A few enthusiastic amateurs published book-length decipherments that were ignored or dismissed by the academic community. Each new claim followed the same pattern: initial excitement, careful scrutiny, and eventual rejection. And it gets worse. In 2004, a paper published in the journal Science by Steve Farmer, Richard Sproat, and Michael Witzel challenged the very foundation on which all these decipherment attempts rested. The authors argued that the Indus symbols are not writing at all. They proposed that the marks are non-linguistic signs, comparable to heraldic emblems, religious icons, clan markers, or totem symbols, a system of visual communication that conveys meaning without encoding spoken language. Their argument was detailed and provocative. They pointed out that the inscriptions are too short to encode sentences or even complete phrases in any known language. They noted the absence of longer texts, arguing that a true literate civilization would have produced at least some extended writings on durable materials. They observed that the sign system shows remarkably little change over the 700 or so years it was in use, which is unusual for a genuine writing system, as spoken languages evolve, and their scripts typically evolve with them. And they compared the Indus signs to other known non-linguistic symbol systems, arguing that the statistical properties of the Indus corpus are consistent with non-linguistic communication. The paper detonated a firestorm. In India, where the Indus Valley civilization holds deep cultural and nationalistic significance, the suggestion that the Harappans were not truly literate was seen as an insult, a denial of ancient Indian achievement motivated by Western cultural bias. Scholars who had devoted their careers to deciphering the script felt their life's work was being dismissed. The debate became ugly and personal, with accusations of prejudice, political motivation, and intellectual dishonesty flying in both directions. Petitions were circulated. Letters were written to journal editors. Threats of legal action were made. The academic decorum that normally governs scholarly disputes broke down entirely. But beneath the anger and the politics, the underlying question was legitimate and remains unresolved. Is the Indus script writing? The answer matters enormously. If it is writing, then somewhere in those 400 signs is the ghost of a language, waiting to be heard. If it is not writing, then the silence is built into the nature of the symbols themselves, and no amount of analysis will ever produce a translation, because there is nothing to translate. The distinction between a writing system and a non-linguistic symbol system may seem academic, but its implications are profound. It is the difference between a locked door and a wall. A locked door implies a room on the other side. A wall implies nothing. The defenders of the linguistic interpretation have marshalled their own arguments. Asko Parpola, who has spent more than 50 years studying the script, points to the regularities in the sign sequences that suggest grammatical structure. Certain signs tend to appear at the beginning of inscriptions, others in the middle, and others at the end, a pattern consistent with a fixed word order or a system of grammatical affixes. Parpola also notes that the number of distinct signs, between 400 and 450, exceeds what would be expected from a purely symbolic system. Heraldic crests and religious icons tend to use smaller inventories of symbols. The large sign count of the Indus system is more consistent with a logosyllabic script. These arguments are cogent but not conclusive, because counterexamples can be found for each point. In 2009, a team led by Rajesh Rao of the University of Washington entered the debate with a new computational approach. Rao and his colleagues measured the conditional entropy of the Indus sign sequences, comparing the results to known linguistic and non-linguistic systems. Conditional entropy measures how predictable the next symbol in a sequence is, given the previous symbol. In highly ordered systems like DNA or computer code, entropy is low. In random sequences, entropy is high. In natural languages, entropy falls somewhere in between, reflecting the partial predictability of grammar and syntax. Rao found that the Indus sign sequences had conditional entropy values within the range typical of linguistic systems, similar to Sumerian, Old Tamil, and Sanskrit. The study was published in Science and was widely reported as evidence supporting the linguistic nature of the script. But the celebration was short-lived. Richard Sproat, one of the authors of the 2004 paper, published a detailed rebuttal showing that Rao's method produced false positives when applied to known non-linguistic sequences. Sproat demonstrated that Vinci symbols from Neolithic southeastern Europe, heraldic badge sequences, and even sequences of Fortran computer code fell within the same entropy range that Rao had identified as linguistic. The test, in other words, could not reliably distinguish writing from non-writing. It was a necessary condition, not a sufficient one. The Indus sequences had the right statistical properties to be writing, but so did many things that clearly were not writing. The debate had reached an impasse. The question of whether the Indus script is writing remains one of the most contentious issues in modern archaeology. It has been called the field's most poisonous debate, and its poisonousness stems precisely from the enormity of what is at stake. If the Harappans could write, then we are looking at the silent library of one of the world's great civilizations, and the possibility of reading it someday, however remote, sustains a kind of hope. If they could not write, then there is no library, no hidden wisdom, no words waiting to be heard. Just symbols, beautiful, enigmatic, and empty. The question of the script is entangled with the question of the civilization's collapse, because it was the collapse that severed the chain of literacy. Understanding how and why the Harappan cities fell is essential to understanding why the script was lost, and the story of that collapse is itself a mystery wrapped within the larger mystery. Sometime around 1900, before the Common Era, according to the best available archaeological evidence, the great Harappan cities began to decline. The process was not sudden. It was not a single catastrophic event. No fire, no earthquake, no army at the gates. It was a slow unravelling that played out over 2 or 3 centuries. Mohenjo-Daro, the greatest of the Harappan cities, shows signs of deteriorating infrastructure in its later phases. The carefully maintained drains became clogged and fell into disrepair. Buildings were subdivided into smaller and cruder apartments. The standardized bricks gave way to irregular ones. The city was not destroyed. It was neglected. It ran down like a great machine whose operators have lost either the skill or the will to maintain it. Harappa tells a similar story. In its later phases, the city shows evidence of overcrowding, declining craft quality, and the breakdown of the urban grid. The precise layout that had characterized the city for centuries became disordered, as new construction ignored the old street plan. The trade networks that had connected Harappa to distant cities began to fray. Imported goods became rarer. Local production declined in quality. Something was going wrong, not all at once, but gradually, relentlessly, like a slow leak that eventually empties a reservoir. For decades, the dominant explanation was invasion. The theory, first proposed in the 1940s and 50s, held that waves of Indo-Aryan-speaking peoples from Central Asia swept into the Indian subcontinent, conquering the Harappan cities by force and imposing their own language and culture. This theory drew on references in the Rig Veda, one of the oldest texts in the Indo-Aryan literary tradition, to a warrior god named Indra who destroyed the fortified cities of a dark-skinned enemy. Archaeologists pointed to skeletal remains found at Mohenjo-Daro, bodies lying in the streets and stairwells, some with apparent signs of violent death. The narrative was compelling and clean. A great civilization, weakened by internal decline, was finished off by barbarian invaders who burned its cities and scattered its people. But the invasion theory has largely collapsed under closer scrutiny. The skeletal evidence at Mohenjo-Daro, re-examined by later researchers, turns out to be far less dramatic than originally claimed. The bodies date to different periods and do not represent a single massacre. Many show no signs of violence at all. The Rigvedic references to destroyed cities are too vague and too distant in time to be reliably connected to specific historical events, and the archaeological record shows no evidence of a sudden violent destruction of the Harappan cities. No burn layers, no mass graves, no scattered weapons. Instead, the decline appears to have been gradual, stretching over centuries, driven not by human enemies, but by something far harder to fight. The most widely accepted explanation today involves environmental change, specifically a shift in the monsoon patterns that sustained the agriculture on which the Harappan economy depended. The Indus Valley is a semi-arid region where rainfall is seasonal and variable. Agriculture in the region depends on two sources of water: the annual flooding of the Indus River and its tributaries, which deposits rich alluvial soil on the floodplain, and the summer monsoon rains, which provide moisture for crops during the growing season. If either of these water sources fails, agriculture fails with it, and with agriculture goes everything else: the surplus food that feeds the cities, the trade goods that sustain commerce, the labour force that maintains the infrastructure. Geological and paleoclimatic studies conducted over the past several decades suggest that around 2000 before the Common Era, the monsoon patterns over South Asia shifted significantly. The summer monsoon, which had been strong and reliable for centuries, weakened and became more erratic. Rainfall declined. The arid conditions that had always been present on the fringes of the Harappan territory pushed inward. Rivers shrank. Lakes dried up. The Gaga-Hakra river system, which many scholars identify with the legendary Sarasvati River mentioned in Vedic texts, appears to have dried up entirely during this period, depriving a vast region of its primary water source. Dozens of Harappan settlements along this river system were abandoned as the water disappeared. The environmental explanation is not a simple story of drought wiping out a civilization. It is subtler and more insidious than that. The monsoon did not stop entirely, it shifted. The rainfall that had sustained the Indus Valley did not vanish from the earth. It moved eastward, toward the Ganges-Yamuna plain, where it continued to fall in abundance, and the Harappan people, it seems, followed the rain. Archaeological evidence shows a significant eastward migration during the late Harappan period, with new settlements appearing in the upper Ganges region and in Gujarat. As the old Indus heartland dried out, the people did not die. They moved, they adapted, they survived. But in moving, they left their cities behind, and they left their script behind. This is the crucial point, the hinge on which the entire mystery turns. The Indus script did not survive the migration. No inscriptions in the Indus script have been found at sites dating after about 1800 before the Common Era. The script simply stops. It was not gradually replaced by a new writing system. It was not adapted or reformed. It ceased to exist. The region that the Harappans had occupied entered a period of several centuries, sometimes called the Dark Age of Indian history, during which no writing was used at all. When writing reappears in the Indian subcontinent, in the form of the Brahmi and Kharosthi scripts around the 3rd century before the Common Era, it bears no resemblance to the Indus signs. The thread was completely, irrevocably broken. Why did the script die while the people survived? No one knows for certain. One possibility is that the script was closely tied to the urban, commercial culture of the great cities, and when that culture dissolved, the need for writing dissolved with it. If the script was used primarily for trade, administration, and ritual within an urban context, then the migration to smaller, more dispersed, and more rural settlements may have made it obsolete. People who no longer traded with distant cities, who no longer needed to stamp seals onto bales of goods, who no longer gathered in large numbers for civic rituals, may simply have stopped using writing because they no longer needed it. Another possibility is that the script was maintained by a specialized class, priests, scribes, or administrators, and that this class was disrupted or disbanded during the upheaval of the late Harappan period. In many ancient civilizations, literacy was the province of a small elite. If that elite was scattered by migration, its members absorbed into new communities where their specialized knowledge was not valued, The tradition could have died in a single generation. The last scribe retires, the last student graduates, no new student enrolls, and the knowledge is gone. A third possibility, and perhaps the most disturbing, is that the script died for no particular reason at all. Cultural practices can simply fade away, not because they are no longer useful, not because they are deliberately abandoned, but because the circumstances that sustain them, the institutions, the teachers, the routines, the social expectations, gradually change, and one day people realize that no one is doing it anymore, and no one remembers how. Languages die this way, crafts die this way, and writing systems can die this way too. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The Indus script died, and it took with it everything it had ever recorded, every name, every title, every prayer, every law, every record, every story. All of it, gone, not destroyed, but simply forgotten, dissolved into the silence of 4,000 years. This discontinuity is one of the great tragedies of human intellectual history. In Egypt, the hieroglyphic tradition lasted for more than 3,000 years, and even after the last hieroglyphic inscription was carved in 394 of the Common Era, the Coptic language preserved elements of ancient Egyptian that eventually helped Champollion crack the code. In Mesopotamia, cuneiform was used by multiple civilizations and languages over 3,000 years, and the continuity of the scribal tradition provided scholars with abundant material for cross-referencing and decipherment. In China, the writing system has been in continuous use for more than 3,000 years, evolving but never breaking. But in the Indus Valley, there was no continuity. The script arose, was used for approximately 700 years, and then vanished. Nothing bridges the gap between its last use, around 1800 before the Common Era, and the modern era. There are no descendants, no intermediate forms, no echoes in later scripts. The break is clean and total. This means that anyone attempting to decipher the Indus script today is working in near-total darkness. They have a small collection of short inscriptions. They have a catalogue of signs whose sound values are unknown. They have statistical patterns whose meaning is ambiguous. And they have a set of images, animals, and geometric forms whose relationship to the accompanying text is unclear. They do not know the language. They do not know the content. They do not know whether the marks even encode language at all. It is, by any measure, one of the hardest intellectual problems in the history of human scholarship. Asko Parpola has called the Indus script the Mount Everest of decipherment. But at least Everest has a summit. With the Indus script, we are not even certain the mountain is climbable. Every route has been tried, every approach has been tested, and every expedition has come back empty-handed. The frustration is compounded by the seductive quality of the inscriptions themselves. The signs are not crude or primitive. They are elegant, carefully formed, and consistent across sites separated by hundreds of kilometers and spans of centuries. They were clearly the product of a mature tradition, refined over generations, taught in a systematic way, and employed with confidence by the people who used them. The craftsmanship of the seals suggests that the carvers took pride in their work. The signs are not scratched hastily into soft clay. They are carved with precision, each stroke deliberate, each curve controlled. Looking at these signs, you feel that you should be able to read them. They look like they mean something. They look like they are trying to tell you something. And that feeling, that tantalizing sense of almost comprehension, is perhaps the cruelest aspect of the entire puzzle. The signs invite you in. They welcome your attention. And then they say nothing. What makes this puzzle so distinctive is not merely its difficulty, but its scale of consequence. The Harappan civilization was not a marginal culture at the periphery of the ancient world. It was a major power, a contemporary and trading partner of Sumer and Egypt, the two other great civilizations of the Bronze Age. Harappan seals have been found at Mesopotamian sites, including Ur and the island of Bahrain, which served as a trading hub in the Persian Gulf. Mesopotamian texts from the Akkadian period make reference to a land called Meluha, which many scholars identify with the Indus Valley or a closely associated region. Meluhan merchants apparently lived in Mesopotamian cities, and Meluhan goods, including ivory, carnelian beads, exotic wood, and possibly cotton textiles, were prized commodities in the markets of Ur and Lagash. If we could read the Indus script, we might fill in one of the great blank spots on the map of early human civilization. We might learn how a vast society governed itself without a visible king. We might learn what religion these people practiced, what myths they told, what gods they worshipped, what rituals they performed in the Great Bath. We might learn the names of the cities, the names of the rivers, the names of the craftspeople who made those exquisite carnelian beads with such extraordinary precision. We might learn things about the ancient world that would rewrite the textbooks, that would add an entire chapter to the story of human civilization in the Bronze Age. But here's what makes this truly terrifying. We might never learn any of it. The script might be too short, the language too lost, the evidence too fragmentary for any solution ever to be confirmed. And if that is the case, then the Indus Valley civilization will remain forever what it is today. A civilization of ghosts, building cities we can walk through but never understand, writing words we can see but never hear. The story of trying to read the Indus script is a story of brilliance, obsession, failure, and the occasional streak of hubris so magnificent it almost becomes tragic. For over 100 years, scholars from every discipline imaginable have thrown themselves at this puzzle, each convinced that they have found the angle, the insight, the method that all previous attempts had missed. Linguists, mathematicians, computer scientists, retired civil servants, amateur cryptographers, and self-taught enthusiasts have all published their theories, their readings, their claimed solutions. As of the most recent counts, more than 100 proposed decipherments have been announced. Not one has been accepted by the broader scholarly community. Not one has produced a reading that other experts can independently verify. To understand why and to appreciate just how deep this problem runs, we need to walk through the major attempts, examine what each one got right and what each one got wrong, and confront the sobering possibility that the methods which worked for every other ancient script may simply be inadequate here. The first approach was the most direct, pattern analysis. If you have a set of inscriptions in an unknown script, the first thing you do is count the signs. You count how many distinct signs there are, how often each one appears, how they combine with each other, and where they tend to appear in a sequence. This was the approach taken by G.R. Hunter in his 1932 study, and it has been refined and expanded by every subsequent researcher. The basic findings are now well established. The Indus script contains between 400 and 450 distinct signs. The frequency distribution is uneven, with a small number of signs appearing very frequently and a long tail of rare signs that appear only once or twice. Certain pairs and triplets of signs recur in predictable combinations. Certain signs are preferentially found at the beginning of inscriptions, others at the end. These patterns are genuinely informative. They tell us that the sign system is structured, not random. They suggest the existence of rules governing which signs can follow which. They hint at something resembling grammar or syntax. But they cannot, by themselves, tell us what any individual sign means. Statistical analysis can reveal the skeleton of a system, its architecture and regularities, but it cannot put flesh on those bones. For that, you need content. You need to know what the inscriptions are about, and that is precisely what we lack. The Dravidian hypothesis, championed most prominently by Asko Parpola and his Finnish team, represents the most sustained and systematic attempt to link the Indus script to a known language family. The argument for a Dravidian identification rests on several pillars. First, geographic plausibility. Dravidian languages are today spoken primarily in southern India, but there is evidence, both linguistic and archaeological, that they were once far more widespread, potentially covering much of the subcontinent before the spread of Indo-Aryan languages. A remnant Dravidian language called Brahui is still spoken by a population in Baluchistan, in the heart of the former Harappan territory, which some scholars cite as evidence of an ancient Dravidian presence in the region. Second, certain structural features of the Indus sign sequences are consistent with what one might expect from a Dravidian language, which tends to use suffixes rather than prefixes and follows a subject-object-verb word order. Third, Parpola has proposed specific readings of individual signs based on the rebus principle identifying pictographic signs with Dravidian words, and then using those words, homophones, to read the signs phonetically. Parpala's most famous example involves the fish sign, one of the most common pictographs in the Indus script. In several Dravidian languages, the word for fish is mean or a variant thereof. Mean also sounds like the Dravidian word for star. Parpala proposed that the fish sign could therefore represent the concept of star or, by extension, a deity or astronomical concept associated with stars. When the fish sign appears with specific modifications, such as additional strokes or marks, Parpala reads these as specifying particular stars or celestial bodies. A fish with 6 strokes, for example, might represent the Pleiades star cluster, which contains 6 stars visible to the naked eye in many parts of the world. The ingenuity of these readings is impressive. The scholarship behind them is meticulous. Parpala has spent more than half a century refining his interpretations, publishing hundreds of pages of detailed analysis, and presenting his work at conferences around the world. He was awarded the Kalainar M. Karunanidhi Classical Tamil Award in 2010 for his contributions to the study of Dravidian culture, and yet his readings remain unverified and unverifiable. The chain of reasoning from pictograph to Dravidian word to rebus reading involves too many steps, each of which could go wrong. Even if the underlying language is Dravidian, the specific word used for fish in the Harappan period might have been different from the word used in modern Dravidian languages. The rebus principle might have been applied differently than Parpala assumes. The pictograph might not even represent a fish. It might represent an entirely different object that happens to look vaguely fish-shaped to modern eyes. At every link in the chain, uncertainty multiplies. The Indo-Aryan hypothesis offers a different identification for the underlying language, but faces equally severe challenges. Proponents of this view argue that the Harappan people spoke an early form of the language that would later become Vedic Sanskrit. The strongest version of this argument was made by S.R. Rao, who proposed in the 1980s and 90s that the Indus script was alphabetic, with each sign representing a single consonant or vowel sound. Rao claimed to have identified the sound values of individual signs by comparing them to letters in the later Brahmi script, which is the ancestor of most modern Indian writing systems. If correct, this would make the Indus script a direct ancestor of Brahmi, providing a connection across the gap of several centuries during which no writing was used. But Rao's proposal was widely rejected. The primary objection is numerical. An alphabet of 400 signs makes no linguistic sense. No known alphabet has more than about 50 letters. If the Indus script were truly alphabetic, it would need only 20 to 40 signs, not 400. Rao addressed this by arguing that many of the 400 signs are variants or ligatures of a smaller set of basic letters, but his method for distinguishing base letters from variants was considered arbitrary. Without an independent check, such as a bilingual text, there was no way to confirm that his groupings were correct. The readings he produced were not accepted by other scholars. The Munda hypothesis, less widely known but periodically revived, suggests that the Harappan language belonged to the Austroasiatic language family, which includes the Munda languages of Central and Eastern India, as well as Vietnamese and Khmer. Proponents argue that certain structural features of the Indus sign system are consistent with Austroasiatic grammar, and that the geographic distribution of Munda-speaking peoples in India could reflect an ancient presence that predates the arrival of both Dravidian and Indo-Aryan languages. This hypothesis has few defenders today, but cannot be definitively ruled out, because the underlying language of the script is simply unknown. Then there is the possibility that the Harappan language was an isolate, a language with no surviving relatives, like Sumerian or Basque or the now extinct Etruscan. If this is the case, decipherment becomes orders of magnitude more difficult, because there is no related language to provide clues about vocabulary, grammar, or sound patterns. The Sumerian language was eventually understood despite being an isolate, but only because the Akkadian-speaking peoples who succeeded the Sumerians continued to use the Sumerian script, creating a wealth of bilingual and multilingual text that allowed scholars to build a dictionary over many decades. No such continuity exists for the Indus Valley. The script died with the civilization. No successor culture adopted it. No bilingual texts exist. If the language is an isolate, then every word must be inferred from context alone, and the context provided by inscriptions, averaging 5 signs in length, is effectively 0. Among the more unusual theories, a number of scholars have attempted to link the Indus script to the much later Brahmi script, which appears in India in the 3rd century before the Common Era, roughly 1500 years after the Indus script vanished. If a connection between the two scripts could be established, it might provide a bridge across the gap, linking the unknown Indus signs to the known Brahmi letters and through them to languages like Prakrit and early Sanskrit. Several scholars have proposed such connections, tracing similarities in the shapes of certain signs. But the proposed connections are visually tenuous and chronologically improbable. 1500 years is a very long time for a writing tradition to survive underground, unattested in any archaeological record. The scholarly consensus is that Brahmi was an independent development, possibly inspired by Semitic writing systems, and has no direct connection to the Indus script. Another approach, attempted by several researchers, has been to look for inscriptions in the Indus script outside the Indus Valley itself. If Harappan merchants lived and traded in Mesopotamia, as the textual evidence suggests, they might have left inscriptions there. A handful of objects with Indus-like signs have indeed been found at Mesopotamian sites, including a few round seals that differ in shape from the typical square Harappan seals, but bear recognizable Indus signs. Some of these objects are genuinely from the Harappan world, carried there by trade, but they are few in number, short in inscription, and accompanied by no bilingual text. The dream of finding a Harappan Sumerian bilingual seal, a mini Rosetta Stone that would unlock the code, has driven many hopeful searches. So far, no such artifact has been found. The artifacts themselves, even those we cannot read, tell a poignant story about the people who made them. The seals are beautifully carved, with a precision and delicacy that speaks to long training and deep skill. The animal figures are rendered with a naturalism that rivals the best work of any ancient civilization. The so-called unicorn, whatever it represents, is depicted with extraordinary care, its body muscular and lifelike, its single horn carried with an almost regal bearing. Below many of the unicorn depictions is a mysterious object that scholars call the standard or cult stand, a small device on legs that the unicorn appears to be sniffing or worshipping. We do not know what this object represents. It could be a brazier, an incense burner, a ritual vessel, or something else entirely. The seal images, like the inscriptions, resist interpretation in the absence of textual context. Among the most famous individual artifacts from the Harappan world is the so-called priest king, a small carved bust found at Mohenjo-Daro depicting a bearded man with half-closed eyes and a band across his forehead. His robe is decorated with a trefoil pattern, possibly representing embroidered cloth. The sculpture is only about 17.5 centimeters tall, but it radiates authority and composure. Who was this man? A king? A priest? A wealthy merchant? We call him the priest king, but the name is our invention, a label we have applied because we cannot read the one he was given at his making. If his name was ever inscribed on a seal, we would not know which seal, and even if we found it, we could not read it. The Dancing Girl, a small bronze figurine found at Mohenjo-Daro by Ernest Mackay in 1926, is another iconic Harappan artifact. She stands in a confident pose, one hand on her hip, her head tilted slightly. She wears bangles stacked up one arm and appears to be nude except for a necklace. She is roughly 10.5 centimeters tall. She is sometimes described as the earliest known lost wax casting from South Asia. Her posture, her expression, her attitude all suggest a personality, a living individual captured in bronze 4,000 years ago, and yet we know nothing about her. We do not know her name, her role in society, her story. She is frozen in bronze, alive with character, and utterly anonymous. These artifacts haunt the imagination precisely because they are so human, so vivid, so present, and yet so voiceless. They seem to be on the verge of speaking. The priest king looks as though he might open his eyes and issue a decree. The dancing girl looks as though she might shift her weight and begin to move. The unicorn on the seals looks as though it might step forward and reveal its name. But none of them do. They remain fixed, beautiful, silent, and unknowable. Let us now turn to the parallel cases that illuminate the Harappan mystery from different angles, because the Indus Valley is not the only ancient civilization that has left behind an unreadable record. The pattern of rise, flourishing, collapse, and silence has repeated itself across the globe, and each instance teaches us something about the fragility of cultural memory. Consider the ancestral Puebloans, the people once commonly known as the Anasazi, a Navajo word meaning ancient enemies or ancient ones. These people built some of the most remarkable structures in pre-Columbian North America. Their cliff dwellings at Mesa Verde in southwestern Colorado cling to the sides of sandstone canyons, multi-story stone buildings tucked into natural alcoves in the rock. Their great houses at Chaco Canyon in northwestern New Mexico were the largest buildings in North America until the steel-framed skyscrapers of the late 19th century. Pueblo Bonito, the greatest of the Chaco structures, contained over 600 rooms and rose 4 or 5 stories high. It was precisely aligned with astronomical events, its walls oriented to track the movements of the sun and moon. A system of roads radiating out from Chaco Canyon connected it to dozens of outlying communities, some as far as 150 kilometers away. The ancestral Puebloans flourished for centuries, from roughly the 6th century to the late 13th century of the Common Era, and then they left. By 1300, the great houses were empty. The cliff dwellings were abandoned. The roads led to nowhere. The people migrated south and east, their descendants becoming the modern Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley, Zuni, Hopi, and Acoma. But they left no written explanation for their departure. They had no writing system. The reasons for their abandonment of the Four Corners region have been reconstructed from tree ring data, which shows a severe drought in the late 1200s, from archaeological evidence of soil erosion and resource depletion, and from signs of increasing social conflict. But the full story, the way the people themselves understood what was happening to them, is lost. Their silence is not the silence of an undeciphered script. It is the silence of a people who never developed writing at all. And yet the result is the same: a great civilization reduced to ruins and inference. The Khmer Empire offers a different lesson. The builders of Angkor in what is now Cambodia created one of the most spectacular urban complexes in human history. Angkor Wat, their greatest temple, covers an area of roughly 200 hectares and is adorned with bas-reliefs depicting scenes from Hindu mythology and Khmer history. The hydraulic system that supported the city, a network of reservoirs, canals, and channels called barrays, was one of the most sophisticated water management systems of the pre-modern world. At its peak, between the 9th and 13th centuries of the Common Era, the Angkor region may have supported a population of nearly 1 million people, making it one of the largest pre-industrial urban areas on Earth. Unlike the Harappans, the Khmer left extensive written records. Their inscriptions, carved in Sanskrit and Old Khmer, have been deciphered, and we can read the names of their kings, the dedications of their temples, the records of their land grants and religious foundations. We know that Suryavarman II built Angkor Wat in the early 12th century. We know that Jayavarman VII expanded the empire and built the Bayon Temple with its enigmatic stone faces. We have, in other words, exactly what we lack for the Indus Valley: a readable record of the civilization's own words, and yet the Khmer Empire still collapsed. By the 15th century, Angkor was largely abandoned. The reservoirs silted up, the canals broke down, the jungle crept in, sending roots through the stones, splitting walls, toppling towers. When French naturalist Henri Mouhot visited Angkor in 1860, he found the temples being slowly devoured by tropical vegetation, the stone carvings hidden behind curtains of vines, and the roots of enormous strangler figs. The Khmer case demonstrates that literacy alone does not guarantee survival. The Khmer could write, their texts survive. We can read every word, but their empire still fell, and for 400 years, the jungle hid their greatest achievement from the world. Göbekli Tepe, in southeastern Turkey, presents perhaps the most mind-bending variation on the theme. Discovered in 1994 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, This site consists of massive stone pillars carved with elaborate animal reliefs, including foxes, vultures, snakes, scorpions, boars, aurochs, and abstract humanoid figures. The pillars are arranged in circular enclosures and stand up to 5.5 meters tall, weighing as much as 10 to 20 tons. According to radiocarbon dating, the site was constructed around 9,500 before the Common Era. That makes it roughly 7,000 years older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It was built by people who, by all available evidence, had not yet developed agriculture. They were hunter-gatherers who somehow mustered the organization, labor, and motivation to quarry, transport, carve, and erect enormous stone monuments. And then, around 8,000 before the Common Era, the builders of Göbekli Tepe deliberately buried the entire site. They filled in the enclosures with soil, rubble, and animal bones, covering the pillars completely. The site was not abandoned to decay, it was intentionally interred. Schmidt spent years excavating the site before his death in 2014, and the question of why the builders buried their creation remains unanswered. There are no texts to explain it, because these people lived thousands of years before the invention of writing. The carvings on the pillars may encode meaning, mythological narratives, clan symbols, ritual prescriptions, but without a decipherment framework, they remain as silent as the Indus seals. Göbekli Tepe reminds us that monumental human achievement can predate literacy by vast stretches of time, and that the absence of writing does not mean the absence of complex thought. It simply means that the thoughts are gone. The numbers are striking when we compare these lost civilizations side by side. The ancestral Puebloans sustained their culture for roughly 700 years and left no writing. The Khmer Empire lasted approximately 6 centuries and left abundant writing that we can read. Göbekli Tepe was in use for perhaps 1,500 years and left carvings but no script. The Harappan civilization lasted for roughly 700 years and left a script that no one can read. In each case, the civilization is gone. In each case, vital knowledge has been lost. The presence or absence of writing shapes what kind of knowledge is lost, but it does not prevent loss itself. The case of the Sea Peoples adds yet another dimension. These mysterious raiders attacked the eastern Mediterranean civilizations around 1200 before the Common Era, contributing to the collapse of the late Bronze Age world. Egyptian inscriptions at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple of Ramesses III, describe a coalition of invaders who came by sea and by land, destroying everything in their path. The texts name several groups: the Peleset, who may be the ancestors of the Philistines, the Cheka, the Shekelesh, the Denyen, the Wishesh. But we do not know where these peoples came from. They are identified only in the records of their victims. They left no texts of their own, no cities, no monuments. They are a civilization defined entirely by its absence, known only through the damage it inflicted. The Sea Peoples represent the most extreme form of historical silence, a people who left no trace except in the terror of others. Cahokia near present-day East St. Louis in the state of Illinois adds a North American counterpart to these global patterns. At its peak, around 1050 to 1200 of the Common Era, Cahokia was the largest settlement in North America, with a population that may have reached 20,000 or more. Its central feature was Monk's Mound, a massive earthwork rising 30 meters above the surrounding floodplain, the largest earthen mound in the Americas. The city had a central plaza, a wooden palisade, and a circle of wooden posts called Woodhenge that functioned as a solar observatory. Cahokia was a center of trade, receiving goods from across the continent, including copper from the Great Lakes, shells from the Gulf of Mexico, and mica from the Appalachian Mountains. It had a complex social hierarchy, with evidence of elite burials, human sacrifice, and elaborate ritual practices. And yet, by 1400 of the Common Era, Cahokia was deserted. The population had dispersed. The mounds remained, but the city was dead. No written records explain the abandonment. We do not know what the Cahokians called their city. We do not know what language they spoke, though it may have been a Shiowan or Muskogean tongue. We do not know the name of a single one of its rulers. The city that was once the center of a vast chiefdom has been reduced to a series of grass-covered mounds beside a highway. Visited by tourists who walk the paths between the earthworks, and try to imagine what once stood there. Finally, we must consider the Etruscans, because their case comes closest to the Indus problem in certain crucial respects. The Etruscans dominated central Italy for centuries before the rise of Rome. They built cities, temples, and tombs of great sophistication. They were literate, having adopted an alphabet derived from Greek. We have thousands of Etruscan inscriptions, and we can read every letter. We can pronounce every Etruscan word. The alphabet is not the problem. The problem is the language. Etruscan is a language isolate, unrelated to Latin, Greek, or any other known language family. Although we understand some Etruscan vocabulary from context and from short bilingual inscriptions, much of the language remains opaque. The longest Etruscan text, the Liber Linteus, contains about 1,200 words and is believed to be a ritual calendar, but large portions of it resist translation. We can read the letters. We cannot understand the words. This is a sobering lesson for those who hope that technology or ingenuity will eventually crack the Indus script. Even when you can read the script, if you do not know the language, understanding remains elusive. The Etruscan situation differs from the Indus situation in one critical respect. The Etruscan alphabet is known, so at least the sound values of the signs are established. With the Indus script, neither the sound values nor the language is known. It is as if the Etruscan problem were doubled, compounded, wrapped in an additional layer of unknowing. The Indus script is not just a locked door. It is a locked door behind another locked door, and the keys to both are missing. What all these cases teach us, when taken together, is that the loss of the Indus Valley civilization's voice is not an anomaly. It is part of a pattern as old as civilization itself. Human societies rise, build, create, and then fade, taking their knowledge with them. Some leave readable records, some leave unreadable ones, some leave none at all. The Harappans are unusual only in the particular combination of factors that make their case so agonizing. They had a script, they used it widely, the inscriptions survive in excellent condition, and yet we cannot read a single word. They are close enough to reach, but too far to grasp. And that nearness, that tantalizing almost readability, is what makes the Indus script the most frustrating puzzle in the history of human knowledge. In the 21st century, new tools have been brought to bear on the problem. Computational linguistics, machine learning, and artificial intelligence have all been applied to the Indus script, each promising to cut through the difficulties that defeated earlier generations of scholars. The results have been illuminating, but once again inconclusive. The most widely discussed computational study, Rajesh Rao's conditional entropy analysis from 2009, has already been described. But Rao's work was only the beginning of a wave of computational approaches. In subsequent years, researchers used Markov models, a type of statistical model that predicts the probability of the next symbol in a sequence based on the preceding symbols, to analyze the structure of the Indus sign sequences. These models confirmed what pattern analysis had long suggested: the sign sequences are not random, they follow rules. Certain signs are far more likely to follow certain other signs than chance alone would predict. This is consistent with a writing system, but as critics repeatedly pointed out, it is also consistent with any structured symbolic system, including one that does not encode language. In 2015, a team at the Indian Institute of Science in Bangalore used network analysis to study the relationships between Indus signs. They represented the sign corpus as a graph, with each sign as a node and each co-occurrence as an edge, and then analyzed the topological properties of the resulting network. They found that the Indus sign network exhibited properties similar to networks derived from natural language texts, including a power law degree distribution and high clustering coefficients. These findings were presented as further evidence for the linguistic nature of the script. But once again, the critics noted that similar network properties can arise in non-linguistic structured systems. In 2018, researchers at the Indian Institute of Technology, Kharagpur, applied deep learning techniques, a branch of artificial intelligence that uses multi-layered neural networks to identify complex patterns in data. Their system was trained on the known corpus of Indus inscriptions and was able to predict missing or damaged signs in incomplete inscriptions with reasonable accuracy. This was a genuine technical achievement, demonstrating that modern AI can extract meaningful patterns from even a very small dataset. But predictive accuracy is not the same as understanding. A system that can predict that sign B usually follows sign A does not know what either sign means. It is pattern without comprehension, like a parrot that can repeat phrases without knowing their meaning. The most ambitious AI-based attempt came in 2021 when a team led by researchers from several Indian universities attempted to use a combination of deep learning and linguistic modeling to assign tentative phonetic values to Indus signs. Their approach was based on the assumption that the script encodes a Dravidian language, and they used known properties of Proto-Dravidian phonology to constrain the space of possible readings. The results were published as preliminary, and the researchers were careful to note that their readings were hypothetical and required independent verification. As of the latest reports, no independent verification has been achieved. The familiar pattern held. Ingenuity produced hypotheses. The hypotheses could not be confirmed. The silence endured. One of the factors that makes the Indus script problem uniquely resistant to computational approaches is the sheer smallness of the dataset. Modern machine learning thrives on big data. The techniques that have revolutionized image recognition, language translation, and speech synthesis require millions or billions of examples to train on. The Indus corpus provides a few thousand short inscriptions, totaling perhaps 10,000 individual signs. By the standards of modern AI, this is not a dataset. It is a rounding error. Training a neural network on 10,000 symbols is like training a medical diagnostic system on 5 patient records. The results may be interesting but cannot be trusted. There have been attempts to augment the dataset through indirect means. Some researchers have incorporated information from the seal images, the animal figures, and other pictorial elements that accompany the inscriptions into their analyses, hoping that the relationship between image and text might provide additional constraints. Others have drawn on comparative data from Mesopotamian and Egyptian texts, looking for parallels in structure or content that might help narrow the range of possible interpretations. Still others have used computer simulations to generate synthetic Indus-like texts and test decipherment methods on these artificial datasets, a kind of controlled experiment in code breaking. These approaches have produced interesting insights, but no breakthrough. The archaeological work, meanwhile, has continued to expand our knowledge of the Harappan world, even as the script remains locked. The site of Dhalavira in the Kutch region of Gujarat, India, has been one of the most important discoveries of recent decades. Excavated extensively since 1990 by a team led by R.S. Bisht of the Archaeological Survey of India, Dhalavira is a large, well-preserved Harappan city that exhibits several unique features. It was divided into at least 3 distinct sectors: a citadel, a middle town, and a lower town, each separated by massive stone walls. The city had elaborate water harvesting and storage systems, including a series of large reservoirs carved into the bedrock, a necessary adaptation to the arid climate of the Kutch region, where rainfall is scarce and seasonal. Dhalavira yielded one of the most tantalizing discoveries in the history of Indus studies: a large signboard found near one of the city's northern gateways, bearing 10 large Indus signs. The signs had been individually crafted, possibly from wood or a similar material, and inlaid into a wooden board that was then mounted above the gateway for public display. This is the largest public inscription ever found from the Harappan period, and its placement suggests that it was meant to be read by people entering the city. If we could read those 10 signs, we might know the name of the city. We might know its motto, its patron deity, its governing authority, but we cannot read them. The signboard sits in a museum, its letters perfectly preserved, its message perfectly silent. The port city of Lothal, in Gujarat, provides another window into the Harappan world and another source of frustration. Lothal was a major centre of trade and bead manufacturing, and it features what some archaeologists believe to be an ancient dockyard, a large rectangular basin connected to the nearby river by a channel. If this interpretation is correct, Lothal would be the earliest known dock in the world, a testament to the Harappan mastery of hydraulic engineering and maritime trade. The site has yielded numerous inscribed seals and other artifacts, adding to the corpus of Indus inscriptions. But the inscriptions from Lothal are, like those from every other site, short, formulaic, and unreadable. The site of Rakhigarhi, in the Indian state of Haryana, has emerged in recent years as potentially the largest Harappan site of all, covering an estimated area of 550 hectares or more, surpassing even Mohenjo-Daro. Excavations at Rakhigarhi, led by Vasant Shinde of Deccan College in Pune, have revealed evidence of a major urban centre with all the hallmarks of Harappan civilization: standardized bricks, drainage systems, craft workshops, and inscribed objects. In 2019, Shinde's team published the results of ancient DNA analysis from skeletal remains found at Rakhigarhi, which provided important genetic information about the Harappan population, but shed no light on the language they spoke or the script they used. The DNA told us who these people were related to. It could not tell us what they said. One of the most poignant aspects of the Indus script problem is the way it has attracted brilliant people who have spent their entire careers on a puzzle they know they may never solve. Iravatham Mahadevan, who compiled the most widely used sign concordance, worked on the Indus script for over 40 years before his death in 2018. He never claimed to have deciphered it. In interviews, he spoke of the script with a mixture of reverence and frustration, comparing it to a beautiful song whose melody you can hear, but whose words you cannot understand. Asko Parpola, now in his 80s, has been working on the Indus script since the 1960s. He has published hundreds of papers and several books on the subject. He has proposed numerous readings, defended them vigorously, and revised them when new evidence warranted. He has acknowledged openly that a full decipherment may not be possible in his lifetime, or perhaps ever, and yet he continues. The script exerts a kind of gravitational pull on those who study it, drawing them deeper and deeper into a puzzle that retreats as fast as they advance. There is a particular kind of tragedy in the lives of these scholars. They are not studying an abstract mathematical problem or a distant star. They are studying the words of real people, people who carved those signs with purpose and intention, people who expected to be understood. Every seal was made by a human hand. Every inscription was meant to communicate something: a name, a prayer, a claim, a greeting. The scholars who study the Indus script know this. They can feel the human presence behind the signs, and they know that the gulf between seeing and understanding may be unbridgeable. It is as if they were standing on the bank of a river, watching someone speak on the other side, seeing the lips move, hearing nothing but the rush of water. The distance is only a few meters, and it might as well be forever. There is yet another comparison worth making, one that is rarely discussed but deeply instructive. Consider the Rongorongo script of Easter Island, or Rapa Nui. This writing system, consisting of lines of small, intricate glyphs carved into wooden tablets, was first documented by European visitors in the 18th century. By the time scholars began serious study in the 19th century, the ability to read Rongorongo had been lost entirely. The islanders could no longer decipher the tablets their ancestors had carved. Only about 24 tablets survive, and the total corpus is extremely small, perhaps comparable in size to the Indus corpus. Like the Indus script, Rongorongo has resisted all attempts at decipherment. Like the Indus script, it may or may not be true writing. Like the Indus script, it comes from a society that experienced catastrophic disruption, including population collapse, slave raids, and epidemic disease, which severed the chain of literacy within a matter of decades. The Rongorongo case shows that the Indus Valley experience is not unique. The pattern of a script surviving while its meaning does not has occurred independently on opposite sides of the world, separated by thousands of years and thousands of kilometers. The fragility of understanding is a universal human condition, not a peculiar misfortune of one particular ancient people. What all these failed attempts and comparisons teach us is sobering in the extreme. The very things that make a society complex and powerful, its specialization, its interdependence, its reliance on institutions and trained professionals, are also the things that make it vulnerable to the catastrophic loss of knowledge. A simple society, a band of hunter-gatherers, or a small farming village has little specialized knowledge to lose. Every member knows how to find food, build shelter, and survive. But a complex urban civilization depends on specialists, engineers who maintain the water system, scribes who read and write the script, priests who perform the rituals, merchants who manage the trade networks. If any of these specializations is disrupted, the entire system can degrade. And if the specialists who maintain the writing system are dispersed, killed, or simply no longer needed, the writing dies, and with it, the civilization's ability to speak to the future. The Harappan civilization was precisely this kind of complex, interdependent system. Its uniformity of weights, measures, and building standards implies a high degree of institutional coordination. Its writing system, concentrated on seals used in trade and possibly in ritual, implies a specialized literate class. When the monsoon shifted and the cities began to decline, that institutional fabric was torn. The scribes scattered, the seals fell into disuse, and the knowledge that had sustained the script for 700 years evaporated in what might have been a single generation. We look at the Indus signs and we see the ghosts of institutions. We see the shadows of expertise. We see the outline of a world that was organized, purposeful, and self-aware, and we cannot hear what it said about itself. And this is where the answer becomes deeply unsettling. The deeper truth about the Indus script is not just about one civilization and one set of symbols. It is about the fragility of all human knowledge, a fragility so profound that we have spent most of our history failing to recognize it. Every civilization that has ever existed has believed on some level that its achievements would endure. The Egyptians built in stone so that their names would last for eternity. The Romans carved their laws into bronze and marble. The Chinese maintained continuous historical records spanning thousands of years. The Harappans, whatever they wrote it on fired clay and stone seals meant to be pressed, stamped, and preserved across generations. None of them imagined that one day the meaning of their words might simply evaporate. And yet, for the Harappans, that is exactly what happened. Not because their cities were destroyed by fire or flood, not because a conquering army burned their libraries, not because an earthquake swallowed their archives, but because the chain of understanding was simply broken. One generation taught the next, and the next taught the one after that, until one day, the last generation that could read those signs grew old, moved away, changed their way of life, or died, and the knowledge was gone. Just like that, silently, completely, without ceremony or acknowledgement. Let that sink in. A writing system used by millions of people across a civilization spanning more than 1 million square kilometers, maintained and transmitted for approximately 700 years, vanished from human understanding, not through violence or catastrophe, but through the quiet attrition of time and circumstance. The people who used it did not know they were the last. They did not hold a ceremony to mark the end of their deliteracy. They did not inscribe a final message for posterity. The last person who could read the Indus script almost certainly did not know they were the last. They probably did not think about it at all. They simply stopped using a skill that was no longer needed in their changed circumstances. And when they stopped, the chain broke and 4,000 years of silence began. This is not science fiction. This is documented history, repeated in various forms across multiple civilizations and multiple millennia. The ability to read Egyptian hieroglyphs was lost for over 1,400 years. The last known hieroglyphic inscription was carved in the Temple of Isis at Philae in 394 of the Common Era. After that date, the tradition of reading hieroglyphs died out entirely, and for more than a millennium, these elaborate carvings on temples and tombs were objects of wonder and speculation, admired for their beauty, but utterly opaque in their meaning. Scholars in medieval Europe and the Islamic world speculated wildly about their significance, proposing that they were mystical symbols, philosophical treatises, or divine revelations. None came close to the truth. It was only the accidental discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799 by French soldiers digging fortifications in Egypt that made decipherment possible. And the Rosetta Stone was a stroke of extraordinary luck. if it had been smashed, discarded, or buried a meter deeper, if the French soldiers had been digging in a slightly different spot, if Napoleon had never invaded Egypt, Egyptian hieroglyphs might still be unread today. The Indus Valley has had no such luck. No bilingual text has ever been found. No Rosetta Stone has been unearthed. And the question we must ask is whether luck is all that separates us from permanent ignorance. Whether the recovery of lost knowledge is always contingent on fortunate accidents, on the right stone turning up in the right place at the right time. If so, then our understanding of the past is far more precarious than we like to believe. We speak of history as though it were solid, a continuous narrative stretching back to the dawn of civilization, each chapter leading to the next. But it is not. It is full of gaps, silences, and holes, periods and peoples about whom we know little or nothing, not because they left nothing behind, but because what they left behind has been rendered unreadable by the passage of time, the loss of languages, and the breaking of chains of transmission. Consider how much of the ancient world's writing has been lost, even from civilizations whose languages we can still read. The Library of Alexandria, perhaps the most famous repository of ancient knowledge, is said to have contained between 400,000 and 700,000 scrolls, representing the accumulated learning of the Greek, Egyptian, Persian, and Near Eastern worlds. Most of those scrolls are gone. We have the titles of many lost works, mentioned in catalogues, citations, and references by later authors. But the works themselves are dust. We know that the Greek playwright Sophocles wrote more than 120 plays. 7 survive. We know that the Greek tragedian Euripides wrote roughly 90 plays. 19 survive. We know that the historian Livy wrote a 142-volume history of Rome, one of the most ambitious historical projects of the ancient world. 35 volumes survive. The rest are gone, lost to fire, neglect, the decay of papyrus, and the indifference of later centuries. And these are losses from civilizations whose languages we can read. Imagine the scale of loss from civilizations whose languages are unknown or whose scripts remain undeciphered. Let that sink in. The knowledge we have of the ancient world is not the whole truth, but a tiny, random, accident-shaped sample of the truth, preserved by the durability of certain materials, the chance survival of certain copies, the fortune of certain discoveries, and the dedication of certain scholars who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Everything else is gone. And in the case of the Indus Valley, everything is gone. Every word, every sentence, every thought committed to writing, every name inscribed on a seal, every prayer pressed into clay, all of it vanished, not destroyed but forgotten, which is worse, because destruction at least implies that someone once cared enough to destroy it. The Harappan silence forces us to confront a deeply uncomfortable reality about the nature of knowledge itself. We tend to think of knowledge as cumulative, a rising curve, each generation building on the discoveries of the last, the total growing steadily over time, always expanding, never contracting. The metaphor of the shoulders of giants captures this assumption perfectly. Newton stands on the shoulders of Galileo, who stands on the shoulders of Copernicus, who stands on the shoulders of Ptolemy, and so on, back through history, each generation lifting the next a little higher. But this metaphor describes only the periods when the chain is unbroken. When it breaks, knowledge does not merely stagnate, it disappears, utterly, completely, as if it had never existed. Skills that took centuries to develop can be lost in a single generation if no one is taught to practice them. The secret of Roman concrete, which allowed the Romans to build structures like the Pantheon that have lasted 2,000 years, was lost after the fall of the Roman Empire and was not rediscovered until modern times. The technique of Damascus steel, used to forge swords of legendary sharpness and flexibility, was lost in the 18th century and has never been fully replicated. The method of manufacturing Greek fire, the incendiary weapon used by the Byzantine Empire, was so secret that when the empire fell, the recipe vanished completely. These are not obscure technologies. These are skills that were central to the civilizations that developed them, maintained over centuries, and then lost, not because they were unimportant, but because the specific conditions that sustained them, the institutions, the apprenticeships, the chains of teacher and student, were disrupted. The Indus script is the most dramatic example of this pattern. in the domain of language and writing. But it is far from the only one. Around the world, languages are dying at an alarming rate. According to estimates by linguists, there are currently between 6,000 and 7,000 languages spoken on Earth. Of these, roughly 40% are considered endangered, spoken by so few people that they are unlikely to survive to the end of the current century. Every 2 weeks, on average, a language dies, its last fluent speaker passing away without having transmitted the full richness of the language to the next generation. When a language dies, it takes with it not just vocabulary and grammar, but an entire way of perceiving and categorizing the world. A unique system of knowledge accumulated over centuries or millennia. The knowledge embedded in an endangered language, the medicinal properties of plants, the behavior of animals, the rhythms of weather and seasons, is often knowledge that exists nowhere else. The loss of the Indus script is, in a profound sense, an ancient version of this modern crisis. It is the same process, the same quiet vanishing, the same breaking of chains, only it happened 4,000 years ago, and the loss is so complete that we cannot even measure what was lost. We know the Harappans had knowledge because they built cities of extraordinary sophistication. We know they had complex social structures because those cities were highly organized. We know they had technology because their engineering was advanced. We know they had trade because their goods appear in distant lands. We know they had art because their sculptures and jewelry are beautiful. But we do not know what they knew about themselves. We do not know their stories, their explanations, their philosophy, their understanding of their own world. That inner life, the life of the mind, the conversation a civilization carries on with itself about who it is and what it means, is gone completely. There is a further dimension to this loss that is rarely discussed but worth pausing over. The Indus Valley was not an isolated society. It was part of a network of Bronze Age civilizations that traded with and influenced each other. The Harappans knew about Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamians knew about the Harappans, or at least about the land they called Meluha. Goods, ideas, and probably people flowed between these civilizations, across the waters of the Persian Gulf, and along overland routes through Iran and Afghanistan. If we could read the Indus script, we might not only learn about the Harappan world itself, but gain entirely new perspectives on the other great civilizations of the Bronze Age. We might discover what the Harappans thought of the Sumerians and Akkadians. We might learn about trade agreements, diplomatic exchanges, or cultural interactions that are known only from one side. The Mesopotamian records tell us that Meluhan merchants lived in their cities. But what did those peons write about? What did they think of and its temples, its markets, its customs? Those letters, if they were ever written, are lost. The Harappan side of the conversation is missing, and without it, our understanding of the entire Bronze Age trading world is incomplete. The weight of the Indus Valley's silence becomes even heavier when we consider the sheer duration of that silence. 4,000 years is not an abstract number. It is roughly 200 human generations. 200 generations of people have lived and died since the last Indus seal was pressed into clay. 200 generations during which the signs on those seals were seen by no one who understood them. 200 generations of rain and wind and dust falling on the abandoned cities. The depth of time is staggering, and it makes the survival of the physical inscriptions all the more remarkable and all the more painful. The stones endured what the knowledge could not. The clay outlasted the language. The medium outlived the message. And here lies the deepest and most unsettling truth of all. When a civilization's writing is lost, it is not just information that disappears. It is personhood. The Harappan people become, in our eyes, a faceless collective, an archaeological category, rather than a community of individuals with names and stories and inner lives. We can describe their pottery styles and their brick-making techniques, but we cannot name a single one of them. We can measure their skulls and analyze their diet from the chemical composition of their bones, but we cannot hear their voices. They are not characters in a story. They are data points in a spreadsheet. And that reduction from person to data point, from individual to specimen, is perhaps the cruelest consequence of the lost script. Every other great Bronze Age civilization has given us names. We know Khufu, who built the Great Pyramid of Giza. We know Hammurabi, who codified the laws of Babylon. We know Sargon, who founded the Akkadian Empire. We know Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as pharaoh. We know Agamemnon, or at least the legend of Agamemnon, from the tablets of Mycenae and the poems of Homer. These names give us a human connection across the millennia, a sense that real people, with ambitions and fears and families, lived and acted in these ancient worlds. The Harappans have given us nothing of the kind. We do not know the name of the architect who designed the Great Bath. We do not know the name of the merchant who first sailed Harappan goods to Mesopotamia. We do not know the name of the sculptor who created the priest king or the dancing girl. They are anonymous, not by choice but by the accident of lost literacy, and their anonymity is permanent. Something is wrong with our assumptions when we speak of the Indus civilization with the same confidence and familiarity with which we speak of Egypt or Sumer. We do not know the Indus civilization. We know its debris. We know its footprint. We know the outline of the building, but not the conversations that took place inside it. And unless the script is deciphered, unless some miraculous discovery provides the key that a century of searching has failed to produce, we never will. This realization casts a shadow not only over the past, but over the present and the future. If knowledge can be lost so completely, so silently, so irreversibly, then what about our own knowledge? We like to imagine that the digital age has made forgetting impossible, that the vast, interconnected archive of the internet ensures that nothing will ever be truly lost again. But this confidence may be deeply misplaced. Digital formats become obsolete with startling speed. Storage media degrade, hard drives fail, servers crash. Companies go bankrupt and take their data with them. Software updates render old files unreadable. Already there are websites from the early 2000s that have vanished entirely, their content lost as completely as if they had been written on papyrus. Computer scientists have a name for this phenomenon. They call it the digital dark age, the possibility that future generations may be unable to access the vast quantities of information we are producing today because the formats, software, and hardware needed to read it will no longer exist. The parallel with the Indus script is instructive. The Harappans encoded information in a medium that seemed durable, stone, and fired clay. That medium did survive. The signs are still sharp and legible after 4,000 years. But the code became unreadable because the tradition of reading it was broken. We encode information in digital formats that seem infinitely reproducible. But formats change, platforms evolve, and the human practices of reading and interpreting can be disrupted by technological change, just as they were disrupted by environmental change in the Indus Valley. In both cases, the lesson is the same. The durability of the medium does not guarantee the preservation of meaning. The physical object can survive while its content is irretrievably lost. This is the deeper truth that the Indus Valley civilization teaches us, not merely about the past, but about the nature of human achievement itself. We build, we write, we create, and we assume that our works will endure. But endurance requires more than physical survival. It requires continuity of understanding, an unbroken chain of minds that can make sense of what was written, spoken, and thought. When that chain breaks, the writing becomes decoration, the cities become ruins, and the civilization becomes a mystery, known only by its silent remains. What does it mean for us, the living, that an entire civilization's voice has been silenced forever? What does it mean that 5 million people lived, worked, loved, raised children, worshipped, grieved, celebrated, quarreled, made peace, built homes, and buried their dead, and left behind a record that we hold in our hands but cannot read? These are not abstract questions for specialists to debate in academic journals. They are questions about the nature of memory itself, about the meaning of legacy, about what it truly means for a people to have existed. We measure the significance of past civilizations by what they left behind that we can understand. Egypt left the pyramids and the papyri, the Book of the Dead and the love poems, the medical texts and the astronomical calculations. Mesopotamia left the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Code of Hammurabi, the mathematical tablets, the astronomical records. Greece left philosophy, drama, geometry, and democracy. Rome left law, engineering, literature, and a political system that shaped Western civilization for 2,000 years. Each of these civilizations persists in our collective memory because we can read their words, because we can hear, however faintly and imperfectly, the echo of their voices across the centuries. We can argue with Plato, we can marvel at Gilgamesh, we can be moved by the love poems of ancient Egypt. These civilizations are alive in a way that transcends their physical remains because their words survive. The Harappans left cities that rival any of these civilizations in engineering sophistication. They left a trade network that spanned from Afghanistan to the Persian Gulf. They left art of stunning beauty and craftsmanship that challenges the best work of their contemporaries anywhere in the world. But without their words, they exist in our memory as a shadow, an outline, a negative space where a civilization ought to be, visible by the things around it rather than by its own light. This should trouble us deeply because it means that the historical record is not a complete or fair account of human achievement. It is a biased sample, skewed heavily in favor of civilizations whose writings survived, whose scripts were eventually deciphered, and whose languages left descendants. The civilizations we celebrate, the ones we teach in schools and write books about and call great, are not necessarily the ones that were objectively most accomplished or most important. They are the ones we can read. There is a philosophical dimension to this that reaches beyond historical curiosity and into the territory of identity and meaning. The philosopher Paul Ricoeur argued that identity is inseparable from narrative, that who we are is constituted by the stories we tell about ourselves. By extension, a civilization's identity is inseparable from the stories it tells, the texts it produces, the words it uses to explain itself and to posterity. The Harappan civilization has been stripped of its narrative. It has no story, at least none that it can tell in its own voice. Everything we say about it is an outsider's reconstruction, filtered through modern categories, modern assumptions, and modern ignorance. We are writing their story for them, based on their garbage and their foundations, and we are almost certainly getting it wrong in ways we cannot even recognize. Consider the debates about Harappan governance and social structure. Some scholars see evidence of a peaceful, egalitarian society. They point to the absence of monumental palaces, the relative uniformity of housing, and the rarity of weapons in the archaeological record. They paint a picture of a cooperative culture, governed by consensus rather than coercion, a kind of ancient utopia. Others argue that we are romanticizing the evidence, projecting modern democratic ideals onto an ancient society about which we know almost nothing. The absence of palaces does not prove the absence of rulers. The absence of visible weapons does not prove the absence of warfare. Perhaps the rulers lived in wooden palaces that have not survived. Perhaps the weapons were made of materials that have decayed. Perhaps the hierarchy was expressed through textiles and body paint and ritual practices that leave no archaeological trace. We cannot know, and without texts we will never know. The debate about Harappan society is not really a debate about evidence. It is a debate about imagination, about which picture of the past we find most appealing. The same problem applies to Harappan religion. The seal images, particularly the so-called Proto-Shiva seal from Mohenjo-Daro, depicting a seated figure surrounded by animals, have been interpreted as evidence of continuity between Harappan religion and later Hinduism. If this interpretation is correct, it would make the Harappan civilization the cradle of one of the world's oldest living religious traditions. But the interpretation is speculative and hotly contested. The seated figure could be a deity, a priest, a mythological hero, or a decorative motif with no religious significance whatsoever, without inscriptions to provide context. Every interpretation is a projection, a mirror in which we see our own assumptions reflected back at us. We look at the Harappan seals and we see what we want to see, what our own cultural backgrounds predispose us to see. The seals themselves say nothing. The emotional weight of this loss deserves more than passing acknowledgement. Every seal that sits in a museum case, every inscription that appears in a scholarly catalogue, is a message from a person who intended to be understood. They carved those signs for a reason. They pressed them into clay for a purpose. They chose those symbols, arranged them in that order, and expected them to communicate something specific to a specific audience. And now those messages sit behind glass, seen by thousands of visitors every year, and understood by none of them. The message has been perfectly preserved, the communication has completely failed, and that combination of preservation and failure, of physical survival and semantic death, is perhaps the most eloquent testimony to human impermanence that exists anywhere on Earth. There is something haunting about walking through the ruins of Mohenjo-daro, as travelers and archaeologists have described. The streets are still there, running straight and true, exactly as they were laid out 4,000 years ago. The walls of the houses still stand, their bricks still precisely fitted. The drains beneath the streets are still intact. The steps of the great bath still descend into the empty pool. It is as if the city were frozen in the moment of abandonment, waiting for its inhabitants to return, to fill the rooms with voices, to run water through the drains, to stamp their seals into fresh clay. But no one is coming back. The inhabitants left 4,000 years ago, taking their language, their names, and their understanding with them. The city remains, but the life that gave it meaning is gone. We are left with the city and the silence, in its own way, speaks more eloquently about human impermanence than any text ever written. Pause for a moment and consider what this means for the practice of archaeology itself. Every archaeologist working on the Indus Valley knows that they are reconstructing a civilization from the outside in. They can describe the shape of the buildings, the composition of the bricks, the chemical makeup of the pottery glazes, the trade routes inferred from the distribution of goods. They can measure, catalogue, classify, and compare. But they cannot narrate. They cannot tell the story as the Harappans themselves would have told it. They are deaf historians, reading lips through a window, reconstructing dialogue from gesture and expression alone. The discipline of archaeology was built, in large part, on the assumption that material culture, the things people leave behind, can reveal the contours of their lives. And it can, to a degree. But material culture without textual context is like a face without a voice. You can see the expression, you cannot hear the words. Consider, too, what the Indus silence means for our understanding of the origins of South Asian civilization. The Harappan period occupies a critical juncture in the history of the subcontinent, sitting between the prehistoric cultures that preceded it and the Vedic culture that followed. If we could read the Indus script, we might understand how one era transitioned into the next. We might learn whether the Vedic traditions absorbed elements of Harappan culture. We might discover connections between Harappan religion and the belief systems that would later crystallize into Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. These questions have been debated for decades, often with intense political and cultural implications, and they cannot be resolved without textual evidence. The Indus silence is not just a gap in the record, it is a gap at the foundation, a missing chapter at the very beginning of the story of one of the world's most populous and culturally rich regions. At the edge of the Thar Desert, where the land turns dry and the winds carry dust from 100 generations, the mounds of Mohenjo-daro rise from the plain like monuments to forgetting. 4,000 years of weather have worn the bricks smooth. 4,000 years of silence have filled the empty rooms. The streets are still there, straight and precise, laid out by planners who knew their geometry, who understood proportion and drainage, and the need for order in a crowded city. But the voices that once filled those streets are gone. The language that once gave meaning to the symbols on the seals is gone. The names of the people who walked these lanes, who bathed in the great bath, who pressed their seals into wet clay to mark their goods and sign their names, are gone. They are not forgotten in the way that a misplaced name can be recalled with effort, looked up in a record, retrieved from a file. They are gone in the way that a word in a dead language, a language with no descendants and no dictionaries and no records, is gone, completely, irrevocably, beyond all reach of memory or technology or hope. This is the lesson of the Indus Valley. Not that civilizations fall, we know that already. Not that great cities can be abandoned and reclaimed by the earth. We have seen it happen on every continent. The lesson is subtler, quieter, and more troubling than either of those familiar truths. It is that meaning itself can perish. The physical record can survive while the ability to understand it does not. The signs can endure while the language dies. The message can outlast the messenger and still be lost, because survival is not the same as comprehension and preservation is not the same as knowledge. A perfectly preserved message that no one can read is not a message at all. It is an artifact. It is a shape. It is a shadow of communication, not communication itself. The Harappans built for permanence. Their bricks were fired at high temperatures to resist the monsoon rains. Their seals were carved from steatite, a mineral chosen for its combination of softness for carving and hardness after heating. Their drainage systems were engineered to last generations. Their weights and measures were standardized to ensure consistency across vast distances and long periods of time. Everything about their civilization speaks of care, precision, and an orientation toward the future. They were not careless people. They were not short-sighted. They planned, they built, they organized, and all of it lasted. The bricks are still here. The seals are still here. The drains still line the streets. The great bath still holds its shape. But the thing that mattered most, the meaning behind the symbols, the intentions behind the engineering, the thoughts behind the art, the prayers behind the rituals, did not last. It evaporated, silently, over centuries, as the people who carried it moved away, adapted, changed, and eventually stopped passing it on to their children. We live in an age that produces more information in a single day than the Harappan civilization produced in its entire 700-year existence. We record everything. Our words, our images, our transactions, our movements, our preferences, our arguments, our declarations of love, and our announcements of departure. We store this information on servers and in clouds and on drives, and we believe, or at least we hope, that it will survive us. But the Harappan lesson suggests a different possibility. It suggests that the volume of information does not protect it from loss. It suggests that the sophistication of the medium does not guarantee the survival of the meaning. It suggests that we too, for all our technology, for all our archives, for all our backups and redundancies and digital preservation strategies, might one day leave behind a record that no one can read, not because the servers have been destroyed, but because the systems that read them have changed beyond recognition. Not because the data has been erased, but because the context that gives it meaning has been lost. The Indus script sits in museums around the world, in the National Museum of Pakistan in Karachi, in the National Museum of India in New Delhi, in the British Museum in London, in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, in university collections from Cambridge to Berkeley. The seals are displayed in climate-controlled cases, lit by soft lights, accompanied by labels that describe their dimensions, their material, their archaeological context, the site and stratum from which they were recovered. The labels tell us everything that can be told: what the seals are made of, where they were found, how old they are, according to the best available estimates, what animals they depict, how they compare to similar seals from other sites. And what the labels cannot say is everything that matters. What do the signs mean? What language do they encode? What did the people who carved them want the world to know? What name was being signed? What god was being invoked? What message was being sent? We do not know. After a century of effort by some of the finest minds in archaeology, linguistics, and computer science, we still do not know. And we may never know. Perhaps that is the most important thing the Indus Valley has to teach us. Not a fact about the past, but a truth about the nature of knowledge, understanding, and human connection. That knowledge is fragile, that understanding is contingent, that the things we take most for granted, our ability to read and write and speak and be understood by those who come after us, are not guaranteed to survive us. They are not built into the fabric of reality. They are maintained actively, continuously, by human effort, by the effort of teachers and students, parents and children, writers and readers, one mind passing its understanding to the next. When that effort stops, even for a single generation, the knowledge can be lost, not damaged, not degraded, lost, gone, as if it never was. 4,000 years ago, someone in the city of Mohenjo-Daro, in a workshop or a market or a quiet room, picked up a seal made of soft grey stone and pressed it into a pad of wet clay. The impression left behind showed an animal, perhaps the mysterious unicorn, and above it, a line of small, careful symbols. That person knew what those symbols meant. They had learned them from a parent or a teacher. They had used them hundreds of times. The symbols were as familiar as their own name, as natural as breathing. They did not question whether the symbols would always be readable. They did not worry that one day, 4,000 years later, someone would hold this same seal and stare at these same symbols and understand nothing. Why would they worry? The symbols were part of their world. Their world would always exist. But their world did not always exist. The monsoon shifted. The rivers changed course. The cities slowly emptied. The trade routes fell silent. The scribes who maintained the writing tradition grew fewer, and then fewer still, and then none. And the symbols, those small careful marks carved with such precision and confidence, became shapes without sound, patterns without meaning, the beautiful, precise, utterly silent residue of a voice that once spoke and now speaks no more. Somewhere in those marks is the echo of that voice, a name, a prayer, a claim of ownership, a declaration of faith, a simple greeting. We stand before them, 100 generations later, separated by the longest silence in the history of written language, and we cannot hear it. The voice is there, the ear is not, and the distance between the two is measured not in years or kilometers, or any unit that can be counted, but in something far more fragile and far more precious. The unbroken thread of understanding that connects one mind to another across the abyss of time. That thread, once broken, cannot be retied. No technology can mend it. No algorithm can reconstruct it. No amount of funding or effort or goodwill can bring back what the breaking of the thread has taken away. That is the truth. The Indus Valley whispers to anyone who will listen, not in words, because the words are lost, but in silence, a silence that has lasted 4,000 years, a silence that may last 4,000 more, a silence that is, in the end, the most eloquent thing the Harappans ever said.